Hi, John.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, and in fact, this is The Wright Show. You are John Thatamanil, and you are at Union Theological Seminary, where I am actually now on the faculty as a visiting professor. And in fact, this conversation is one of a series that I'm doing with Union faculty. And you have, you're also, I should say, the author of the book, The Eminent Divine, and you're working on other things. You have a pretty distinctive portfolio there, I would say, in that you think about and write about Hinduism, and in particular a variant of Hinduism or a school of thought known as Vedanta, Buddhism, and Christianity. And in fact, you're working on a project that kind of relates those three religions theologically, I guess you could say. Is that a fair way to put it?
Exactly right.
Okay. And I want to get to that. I think we should probably start out with some basics that will set the stage for that. And maybe the place to start is with Vedanta. I think that may be the thing that the fewest of our viewers know much about of the three traditions we're going to touch on. Is it fair to say that Vedanta is, broadly speaking, is a kind of relatively modern version of Hinduism? Is it a little like what liberal theology is to Christianity, or what?
No, Vedanta is quite old. The word itself means the end of the Veda. Mm-hmm. But also in the sense of conclusion, or the summation, the telos of the Vedas. Mm-hmm. And one meaning the word has is to refer to those texts that come at the end of the Vedas, which are the Upanishads. So, I mean, we're talking texts that probably can be dated 8th century BCE. Mm-hmm. And on. So Vedanta, as a school of theology, is a commentarial tradition on those texts. And those texts have had commentaries for millennia now.
Okay.
So in that sense, Vedanta is very old.
Okay, I guess what I kind of had in mind is that of all the things in all of the Hindu texts, which include like a lot of references to a lot of gods and everything, I think of Vedanta as focusing on, some of the more abstract philosophical questions almost, and leaving some of the God talk kind of on the margins in somewhat the way liberal theology does, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's not a bad thought, though the philosophical reflection is already in the Vedanta,
right,
in the Upanishads. So, I think what you mean to say is that, and I think you would be right, that certain strands of the Vedanta tradition enjoy a prominence in the contemporary world that might be for reasons analogous to the ways in which liberal theology enjoys a promise.
Yeah, I mean, I was, talking to your colleague at Union, Gary Dorian, an expert on liberal theology, and I said, I talked about the fact that Paul Tillich, liberal theologian who was also at Union, defined God as the ground of being, and Gary pointed out that, well, actually, you can find that kind of thinking in ancient Christian thinkers, and yet liberal theology is a particularly, it's a selective take on all of the ancient thought that makes it kind of modern, the thinking kind of appropriate for a modern sensibility in some sense. But in any event, why don't we get to some of the specifics of Vedanta? I think the most relevant strand of Vedanta, as I understand it, to your work, may be Advaita Vedanta.
Right.
Is that right? Do you want to tell us what Advaita means? And I also think that's the variant that most people hear about. If they hear about Vedanta in say, the United States, it's probably more likely to be Advaita. But anyway, why don't you tell us what that is?
And you're correct on that point. It is, in fact, the case that is the most prominent modality of Vedanta in the West. Advaita literally means non-dual. Dua is related to our dual. They're cognate words. Sanskrit and English are cognate languages, and a is the negative prefix. So literally translated, it means non-dualism. Now, figuring out precisely what that means is, of course, the task of the commentarial tradition. But roughly, there's some consensus that Advaita means that the ultimate reality and the true ground of the self are not two. That oneself, at its deepest level, is identical to the ground of the world. And that ground of the world is Brahman. The ground of the self is Atman, which just means self, the inmost or true self. And Atman and Brahman are the same.
So that is the fundamental principle. That is non-dualism. There is the distinction you imagine between Atman, the self, the soul, you, and this thing called Brahman, which may be harder to wrap our mind around, I don't know, is illusory. You are actually part of that larger body. Now, I've heard Brahman described as like a universal soul. That's not the way you described it.
The classical tradition refers to Brahman in two sets of words. At the oldest level, in Shankara, the master teacher of the Advaita Vedanta tradition's thought, he designates Brahman with reference to three words: Sat, Chit, Ananta. Sat is being, Chit is consciousness, and Ananta means infinity. The later tradition modifies this slightly in a distinction that's almost difficult to hear and speaks of three other words: Sat, Chit, and the third word is Ananda, which means bliss rather than infinity. But these three or four words are good ways to get in what the tradition goes to when it tries to speak of Brahman. Sat means being, or the ground of being, as you mentioned with respect to Tilak. So Brahman is the ground of being, that which gives being to all beings. Chit, consciousness. Not a consciousness, but the power of consciousness, sometimes called Chit Shakti. And Ananta, infinite. This is not a particular consciousness, but an infinite reality that is the ground of all consciousness and all being. So those are three ways of describing. And of course, very soon the tradition also adds the notion of Ananda, that in some sense this reality is intrinsically blissful, joyous.
Okay.
So those are some ways of talking about Brahman straight from the tradition.
So Brahman is kind of the most fundamental stuff.
Correct.
And it's life-giving, consciousness-giving, maybe equated with consciousness itself, I don't know, but it's...
Correct.
So it's important. We can agree. Now, it's interesting, the reference to bliss is interesting, because here I think we can move into some territory that some viewers may be familiar with if they meditate, as a growing number of people seem to do. Now, a question I have, in the Hindu tradition, in the Vedanta tradition specifically, is it the case that sometimes a blissful meditative state is said to involve experiencing the union of Atman and Brahman? I mean, is that what the bliss resides in? Is that through meditation you are kind of apprehending the unity between you and the ground of being, or whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's actually an internal debate in the tradition about whether Brahman can be experienced. On the one hand, Shankara himself seems to argue that it can't be experienced because it doesn't need to be experienced. It's the thing that's making all experience possible. Mm-hmm. So an analogous claim is made in some Buddhist traditions that the tip of the finger can't touch itself. So likewise, the light that illumines the mind doesn't need another light to illumine that light. You don't, just as if you have a candle that's lit, you don't need another candle next to it to illuminate the first candle. So in some strands of the Vedanta tradition, non-dualism is understood to be so pervasively the case right now that all that one needs to do is to remove the error that you're just a private little tiny consciousness, which is an idea that comes because you identify yourself with your body and your mind and such, which obviously are finite. So as these adjuncts are removed, and one begins to realize through reading the scripture that Brahman is this reality that is consciousness that's illumining you right now, that cognition, that knowledge, that certainty is sufficient. But others in the Vedanta tradition say no. There has to be some kind of experience that generates a kind of awakening. And so there is this other category of some Vedantins who say anubhava is important. That's the term for experience. So yes, in meditation one can come to a kind of direct experience that confirms what the scripture teaches. So that's two different arguments within the tradition, both having grounds within the tradition for making their arguments.
Well, do even those who deny that it's a kind of special and unusual experience to experience the unity of Atman, the first of the schools you described, I guess, do they put emphasis on meditative experience, or are they just not emphasizing that at all? Or I mean, are the two schools equally emphasizing deep meditative experience and just putting different spins on them, or what?
Not quite. I mean, there's a greater emphasis on scripture in those who say that the tip of the finger can't touch itself.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yes, meditation plays a role too, because one does have to do certain kinds of transformative work on oneself before one can understand the notion that you are Brahman. There are all kinds of ways in which that sentence delivered to an improperly prepared person can go wrong. I mean, for example, if I'm deeply steeped in egoism and attachment, it might be really nice for me to hear that I am Brahman. Oh, nice, sweet, I'm Brahman. Well, this is precisely the opposite of what one wants to have happen. Namely, the notion that one is Brahman is a notion that transcends the ego.
Right.
So contemplative practice is one of the ways in which the mind itself is purified, so that the mind is properly ready to understand that there is something within that exceeds and even transcends the mind and illumines the mind.
So it's not so much an elevation of your identity, which would be egoistic, as a dissolution of your... Well, no, you don't want to say that, because then you're starting to get into Buddhist territory, which we'll get to. The differences between... An important doctrinal difference between Hinduism and Buddhism. So is that not the way you would not describe it as a dissolution of identity in the Hindu tradition?
No, a relativization might be the better way of putting it, that one's conventional identity is the self as ordinarily known, and then one's ultimate identity is one's identity as Brahman or Atman.
I gather those, particularly those who emphasize the meditative apprehension of this truth, would say that a powerful meditative apprehension of the truth can change the way you live? Can in other words, can make you live in accordance with the moral implications, kind of Atman equals Brahman?
Absolutely. The guru, or the one who's realized, and one can speak in languages of awakening here too, is a person who is so grounded in one's infinite identity that one becomes an ocean of compassion. So there's a kind of moral infrastructure in both Buddhist and Hindu traditions about things that one ought to do. And that infrastructure holds so long as one hasn't arrived at a kind of deep transformative knowing of ultimate reality. But once you know what you truly are, or in the Buddha's case, know what you truly are not,
right,
then you don't need the moral infrastructure holding you up. And therefore I speak of a kind of trans-ethical or trans-moral moment in life in which one now embodies what one had to have an infrastructure for.
Right. So rather than kind of strenuously and consciously abiding by moral rules, you naturally do the selfless thing, so to speak.
Brilliantly put.
So the word selfless, this brings us to Buddhism, and there's the connection here is really interesting, both the connection and the contrast. So what you might call the Buddhist version of the meditative experience we just described is called the not-self experience. And in Buddhist doctrine, the idea is, again, there is a kind of, you might say, breakdown between the sense of your own distinct identity and something larger. Okay, there is a kind of a dissolution of boundaries, you might say, in experientially, in the Buddhist not-self experience, but the philosophical interpretation of it is different because, almost 180 degrees, because the Buddhists say the self does not exist, right? So, now my own guess is that what a Hindu is experiencing and what a Buddhist is experiencing in these two deep meditative apprehensions may be pretty much exactly the same. I'm not sure, but in terms of what's going on in the brain, what it feels like. But the philosophical, there's a real contrast of philosophy here that's subtle but is greatly emphasized on both sides of the divide, right?
I'm hooked on this idea as to whether it would look the same in the brain.
Yeah.
I'm halfway thinking that we probably can empirically run the test on that now. In the sense,
I have an anecdote about that, but go ahead.
But I mean, it occurs to me that if you have someone who's a practitioner in the contemplative tradition within the Advaita stream who has had an experience of Atman Brahman, you can compare that with someone who might have had or is practicing for another kind of experience and see if different centers of the brain get illuminated. Mm-hmm. So the neuroscience would be fascinating. But you're quite right to say that the interpretations are significantly different and the philosophical issues matter significantly. And one of the deepest insults within Buddhist traditions that you can give to a fellow Buddhist is that you're really a crypto-Hindu. Mm-hmm. That you're sneaking in the old Vedanta idea of a substantive self. Mm-hmm. Because if you want that, there's no reason to do that within the Buddhist tradition. You can just go and be a Hindu. So there are arguments on these issues within Buddhist traditions and within Hindu traditions. The Buddhists insist, in the earliest formulations, that the way to solve the human problem, which is often spoken of as ignorance, manifesting itself in craving, aversion, and delusion, is to be solved not by imagining that there is an infinite self behind the stage, but by dissolving the need for any self that might do the clinging or the hatred or the aversion or the delusion. And so the assault on the finite ego happens by dissolving that ego and coming to the realization that there is no abiding self that could cling to anything anyway. The Hindu says, no, that's not the way you do it. You get rid of just those poisons, and the diagnosis is identical in that sense. It's the prognosis, which is identical in some ways, but radically different in the others. The prognosis on the Hindu side is, once you realize that you are the infinite self, then what could you possibly crave? What could you possibly loathe? Secure in this identity of yourself as the ground of all being, in that sense you transcend egos and attachment, craving, and delusion.
Okay. So the so-called three poisons that you hear a lot about in Buddhism, sometimes translated as greed, hatred, and delusion, although greed and hatred are meant probably more broadly than those words may connote to people. But in any event, you're saying those are paralleled in those also exist in Hinduism as these three fundamental problems?
Correct.
And do we know, I mean, I don't want to get too tribal and territorial here, do we know in whose text this is found earliest?
The texts emerge roughly at the same time.
Okay.
And there's some sense that it's within the same circle of renunciants in which these ideas were being formed. You'll find these ideas also in Jain traditions as well. Mm-hmm. So I think the diagnosis between these traditions is I often use the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha as a way to set up comparisons between traditions. The truth of suffering is the diagnosis. Why? What gets me there is the etiology. Prognosis, complete enlightenment is possible. And then, of course, method, the therapy. So diagnosis, etiology, prognosis, therapy. But you can get considerable agreement on diagnosis within Buddhist and Hindu traditions. You can even get tremendous agreement that something like radical liberation is possible. Mm-hmm. Now, when you start speculating about the ontology of that, that's when things go haywire.
Yeah, I got a sense for this in I taught an online course called Buddhism and Modern Psychology. It was a MOOC, and I had various because my own meditative prowess is limited. I had on video some people that I'd had conversations with who were like really serious meditators. And there was this one guy who actually had studied in both Buddhist traditions and Advaita. And he was describing the experience of kind of the bounds of self dissolving. And he talked about there being no self. And that was like a properly Buddhist way to put it. That he felt like there was nothing in there. And he said he felt like all is one. And there he got into trouble with the Buddhists among the students in the comment section said, no, wait, it's not, the Buddhist doctrine isn't that everything is one. It's that, I don't know how far we want to go with this, but maybe we should actually go into this doctrine of emptiness, which is important in your own, the thinking you're doing now. Mm-hmm. But what they meant was, you can't say everything is one because that sounds like there is a self to be united with things. And it also, sounds like there's, let's talk about emptiness, and maybe then it'll become clearer what these serious Buddhists objected to in the way he was putting this. Emptiness is a hard thing to wrap your mind around. It's probably not exactly what it sounds like. And like not self, it is a meditative apprehension, among other things. It is both a philosophical doctrine in Buddhist philosophy and a thing you can experience through meditation. Now, how do you describe emptiness in a way that makes it accessible to people who have not had the experience?
It helps to work through the Sanskrit. Actually, when one does this work, you have to ask, what is the thing that is being negated with the word empty? And when you do that work through the classical texts on this, particularly those of the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, then you quickly realize that what's being negated is the idea that anything whatsoever has a stuff or essence that is its own. So, Nagarjuna and others in his tradition will argue, well, if anything whatsoever had an essence that it possessed, that wasn't it in fact derived by way of relationship, then that thing would be eternal. Right? So if Robert had some Robert essence that was essentially what Robert is, and that was not derived apart from one's relations, Robert's relations with father, mother, family, and so forth, then Robert would be eternal. But in fact, Robert is not eternal. He does not have any such private essence. That word for essence is swabhava, often translated in this literature as either self-existence or own being. What emptiness is negating is the idea that anything whatsoever has swabhava, own being, essence, self-existence.
Kind of self-sufficiency, right?
Yeah, self-sufficiency or any metaphysical essence or core.
Right. So the doctrine of emptiness. It's not saying there's nothing out there when you look in the world at the world, and the world is entirely an illusion. It's that everything you see is so interrelated with things. So the tree depends on the soil and the nutrients and the air and everything and the sunshine. Everything is so interrelated that if it didn't have the other things, it would cease to exist as you see it. So it's a testament to the subtle interconnection of everything. And that interconnection, and it's an actual interdependency. So things cannot continue existing indefinitely without the other things. That's philosophically kind of what, and you can see it's a pretty fine distinction between saying everything is interrelated and using that noun thing, everything. And if you put it that way, you might get in trouble with Buddhist philosophers, even though that's kind of what they're saying, right? So,
yeah. And this is where matters get very technical within the tradition. There are debates, of course, within all of these traditions. But yes, one way to speak of what emptiness is denying is the very idea of thingness, that reality is not made of discrete things that are then subsequently in relation.
Right. Without the relations, they wouldn't be there in the first place.
That's correct. And every way of looking at the world is a way of dividing this continuum of relations into things. And it's useful to do that. I mean, if you want to get someone to get you the apple, you say, well, get me the apple from the fridge or from the fruit bowl. So we need to name these things. But the ways we name and organize reality for conventional purposes is sometimes mistaken for the way things really are. And this leads to profound error and arguably cataclysmic problems for the human species. I mean, the failure to realize our interrelatedness is partly what is bringing us now onto the verge of ecological devastation. Mm-hmm. So there are profound ways in which getting our idea of what a thing is messed up can cause harm for ourselves and, of course, for the species and for the planet itself.
Okay, I want to now move to Christianity and at least start hinting at some of the ways you're relating these things to Christian theology, although to get deeply into it, we may have to await another second conversation between you and me. Before we do that, there's something a parallel I meant to draw between Buddhism and Hinduism, and it's that notwithstanding these different interpretations of what I think may be fundamentally the same meditative experience, in other words, in the case of Vedanta, it's Atman, the feeling of Atman being Brahman. In the case of Buddhism, it's the feeling of Atman, in other words, self not existing at all. Notwithstanding those differences of interpretation, the idea in Buddhism, just as in Vedanta, is that the experience has this profound moral effect. So that, so that once there is, and you actually did, you definitely hinted at this, but I wanted to underscore it, that once you're just not feeling like a self, then all the motivation you would have otherwise had to do things that are bad for other people dissipates. So in both cases, the meditative experience is supposed to make, you might say, make a moral existence natural.
And I love the way you put it. Make natural in that transmoral sense that I often talk about, that or transethical, that somehow this becomes the spontaneous disposition of the realized person.
Okay.
These traditions don't want you just to be a good person in the sense of checking off a set of obligations formulated in some fashion in texts or in monastic law codes that tell a monk how to behave, but in some sense want the person to become compassionate.
Right. I mean, they have such codes, right? I mean, you can find specific strictures, but the goal, the ultimate goal for the serious practitioner is to not need the guidance, you might say.
Right. To have arrived at a point where the inward turn is so radically attenuated that one's spontaneous disposition is towards care. Mm-hmm. Care for the other, care for the world, care for all creatures.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of territory here. First of all, what are probably the two fundamental philosophical doctrines of Buddhism, not self, and emptiness. Emptiness being more emphasized in some Buddhist traditions than others. And we've talked about the non-dual idea in Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, of self or soul being kind of identical to part of whatever, equated with the larger, most fundamental stuff that pervades everything and gives life and consciousness and so on. Now, you're doing some work that draws on some of these ideas in making connections between, among Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. And I think on the Christian side of it, you're putting a lot of emphasis on the Trinity, right? The idea that Christian theologians have had to really wrestle with of God being at once the Father, the Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, in Christian discourse, that Trinitarian stuff is always there, but it's become attenuated in some ways, in some liberal circles, because no one quite knows how to speak about Trinity in ways that make sense. One sort of engages in hand-waving, well, somehow one, somehow three, and so forth. And so, Trinity Sunday comes along in high churches, and then the minister sometimes tries to make an effort at trying to explain to Christians what Trinity is. But in pews, in congregations, it's something we say when we say the creed, but not something that has any sort of purchase in the lived imagination of Christians, often. I don't want to generalize over much. But there is this notion that that the divine life is not just an undifferentiated singularity, that there is some difference within the divine life, but a difference that doesn't fall into sheer plurality. It's a difference that held together in some fashion, that is a unity. So, and then the language that the tradition has used is Father, Son, and Spirit. But I think when I turn to the matter of thinking about Trinity, I think of the Father as something like the ground of all things, to use the being itself language.
And which would equate with Brahman.
That's correct. And Spirit has always been, in Christian traditions, hard to define as any kind of thing at all, because it doesn't seem to be a thing. It seems to be that within the divine life that binds all things together. Augustine used the image of lover, beloved, and love itself in referring to the Trinity. The beloved is the Son, love itself is the Spirit, and the lover is in some sense understood to be the Father. So note the way love works here, right? Love itself is not a thing. It is that binding principle. So I correlate this notion of Spirit with Buddhist notions of interrelatedness or emptiness. And then, of course, we've already said what the Father is. The Son is the tricky thing. Of course, it is what makes Christian discourse distinctive. The Son is the one for whom, says Colossians, the world was created. The Son seems to be that in and through which all things are made, and made in their particularity, in their distinctiveness. So for me, the notion of the Son is a way of distinguishing between, without falling into thing talk, a way of referring to the world as created and special, a way of distinguishing and speaking of each thing as precious, a way of signaling that reality is marked by contingency is a phrase I sometimes use, that each thing is what it is, unique, distinctive, and singular. So the arch of your eyebrows and the arch of mine. No reason that these need to be wildly different, and yet they don't ever quite match. That the world is shot through with diversity and particularity. I use the notion of the Son as a way of distinguishing and speaking to a God who creates a world marked by exuberant diversity.
Okay, and you're right. Contingency is so you have used that term in some of your writing to be the kind of, I guess, translation you might say of the Son part of the Trinity. Contingency means, to a lot of people, contingency means, it's the opposite of determinism. Kind of, it's the fact that anything can happen. The future is not predetermined. Something weird, you win the lottery, changes your life. You slip and fall down, and that changes everything. Do you mean? I'm not sure you mean to emphasize that part of the term contingency, or do you?
I do and don't. It may not be the best term for what I want to eventually say. It's what I'm going with for now. I talk about three kinds of experiences of wonder. The wonder that there is anything at all, the wonder that whatever is distinctive, particular, special, evanescent, need not have been but is. And then the wonder that anything that is what it is precisely by way of its relations.
Okay.
So being, or sheer being, being contingent, and being relational. These are three kinds of primordial modes of wonder that I think human beings and their traditions differently orient around. Some traditions focus more on one of these kinds of wonder than on the other.
Okay.
So the wonder that anything is at all, I think of as related to the notion of God as Father or ground of being. The notion that the wonder that anything that is relational and can't be apart from its relations, I associate with spirit, with the Buddhist notion of emptiness. And this notion that the world is full of distinctive, particular, beautiful, evanescent, need not have been but is things. That's what I signal by contingency.
Okay, so am I correct in saying that the first of those, you're making the fundamental connection with Hinduism, with Vedanta, the idea of God as kind of the ground of being, or the fact that there is being is the source of wonder. Second of those, you're relating to Buddhism, specifically emptiness and the implied idea of interrelationship, interdependency. It's the wonder of that. And then the third of those, where you relate Jesus to, you see Jesus as kind of symbolizing, you might say, contingency. That's not a connection to any particular Eastern tradition, or is it?
No, I mean it's a way of talking about what I take to be happening in any sort of theistic tradition that wants to affirm that the world is created, the world is in some sense distinct and not merely equivalent to the divine life. God saw all that God had created and saw that it was good. Mm-hmm. That the notion of the Son is also equated with notions of creation in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word is that through which everything that came into being comes into being. So that notion of contingency, logos, Christ, is a way of naming the special, really ridiculous exuberance of diversity within creation.
Right. Logos is the Greek word that is translated as word, perhaps misleadingly, since logos was an actual philosophical term back in the day, probably when the book of John was written, with a whole philosophical resonance about a kind of logic running through history, kind of divine logic animating history, you might say, to put it a little...
Yes, and in some traditions within the Greek philosophical canon, also as the world's soul. So as the ordering principle, the structuring principle of not just time, but also history and also cosmos itself.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions about this. First of all, what is the one about the motivation for this whole line of thought on your part, and to what extent that has to do with the fact that we live in a completely, in an increasingly kind of small world, and we're making contact with other faiths, and it's good to draw what connections we can. There's that. But before we get to that, what's kind of the claim you're making? I mean, are you saying, actually, this was the idea from the beginning? Theologians have wrestled with what does the God and the Father and the Holy Spirit mean? This is, it's kind of like, finally we can decode what the Bible means, right? Are you saying that this is finally we have the interpretation that was intended from the beginning? Or are you saying, well, this is a way we can think about this that's more compatible with a modern sensibility, maybe has this second virtue of relating to other religions, or what?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to go with the second option.
You don't claim to have finally decoded the Bible.
Yes, it would do wonders for my book sales if I pitched it that way.
If I were you, that's the one I would go with. I have some experience with media and observing what kinds of people become famous in this world. And if I were you, I would say the most outlandish thing possible. But it's up to you. Okay, so you're saying, although at the same time there is, I mean, if you're asking a serious Christian to take this seriously, the idea, right, it would be that there's a kind of truth that was in a way there from the beginning, that this is one way of phrasing or something, right?
Yeah, there's an ancient Greek and Latin notion of, I'm probably going to get the Latin wrong here, vestigia trinitatis, this notion that there are signs or vestigial signs of the Trinity, somehow within all of creation. And that's always sort of been there. And one can see that my extrapolation might be doing that. But yes, I do think that Trinitarian thinking, in some sense, intuits this, that there is a principle in the divine life that binds all things together. There is a principle in the divine life that gives rise to being. And there is a principle in the divine life that gives rise not just to generic being, but contingent, special, particular, delightful, good, beautiful, fragile, evanescent being. And this is not wildly different from core motifs that run through the Christian tradition. Now, why do this interrelated, interreligious stuff as well? Well, I am suggesting that this counterintuitive notion that maybe Christians can understand themselves better by dialogue with other religious traditions.
Okay.
Maybe that there are dimensions of my own tradition that I, for the first time, really get when I really understand and am engaged in conversations with other traditions. So it's not to say that Christians knew all this already, but I certainly didn't come to think of this way of talking about Trinity when I was just reading Christian Trinitarian texts. This idea came to me precisely because I spent my time, decades, reading Buddhist and Hindu texts, and then it occurs to me, oh my, maybe there is a way that I can draw these insights both within the Christian tradition, then enrich the Christian tradition thereby, and preserve the diversities of these insights. So, you're part of the reason why I want to sort of stay open to whether these, the Buddhist notion of interrelatedness and the Hindu notion of non-dual ground or Atman Brahman looks the same in the neural wiring, is that I'm not totally sure that they are the same thing. These might be two different kinds of non-duality, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I want to lay it open, and even lay it open to the possibility that this might look different neurally. In other words, I want to think of the religious traditions as not necessarily saying the same thing, but different things that might be rendered compatible. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I have a question about it. But first, I would say you could also throw in, as far as the neurochemistry and the meditative experience, you could throw in Christian mystics and their sense of union with the divine, which sounds a little more like the Hindu thing than the Buddhist thing. So you can do that comparison too. I actually think there's some of that going on, like at Penn or somewhere, and I should get up to speed on that. But and we'll see what they have to say. But but on that this point, so what position does this imply on kind of the question of, like, what is the relationship of different religions to the truth? So it's, there is one metaphor you hear sometimes is, well, the religions are climbing the same mountain from different sides, but they're getting to the same thing. I guess you might say that that's consistent with the idea of the perennial philosophy, maybe, where you assert that there is this common denominator of all faiths. If you get down to a kind of abstract level and strip away the names of specific gods and so on, and get kind of to a kind of deep Eastern mystical kind of level or something, they're all saying the same. Aldous Huxley wrote this book, The Perennial Philosophy, I think. What are you saying about what the relationship of the different religions is to the truth?
That question itself is a shrewd one, because I am trying to address just that question in my work. So in contemporary Christian discourse about this, and in philosophical discourse, there are some who hold to the one mountain position, with the different religions being paths up the same mountain. John Hick is the most famous exponent. But a dear friend of mine named Mark Heim has suggested a slightly different image. He has asked us, what if we're climbing different mountains? All worth climbing, but not the same mountain. So he's written an eloquent and fine book called Salvations, with the S being critical. There are different real goods that are worth having. Mm-hmm. So you're really climbing different mountains. I take myself to be in neither camp. For me, the analogy I like to think with is the old Indian metaphor of the blind man and the elephant. In my writing, I'm making that slightly different. I'm talking about blindfolded man and the elephant. We don't need to get into that precisely. But the point of that old story is that each person who walks up to the elephant, one who touches the side and says, this thing is like a wall, and another one grabs the leg and says, this thing is like a tree trunk, you fool. How could you be so wrong? It turns out both are right about what they affirm, but wrong about what they deny. They genuinely get something true and distinct. It is true that the elephant really is like a wall and like a tree trunk, or like a spear, or like a rope if you grab the tail. The task of the theologian in the contemporary moment, the comparative theologian in particular, which is one of my job descriptions, is to figure out how the apparently very diverse things that our traditions say might be held together without washing out the difference. I think the one mountain stuff tends to wash out difference. Multiple mountain stuff can run the risk, though this is not, I think, Mark Heim's intention, of dissolving into diversity. In fact, if we're really climbing different mountains, one even wonders what the point would be of seriously studying or even practicing another tradition, as many people today are doing. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I think my hypothesis works better is that it makes better sense of multiple religious belonging. Right? Why do Christians do Christian things and Buddhist things? Well, if they're really just the same thing, you wouldn't need to do both. And if they're completely different things, you couldn't do both. Just like no one can straddle two mountains, at least not for long. My intuition of difference that can be held together is, I think, the best one to hold both difference together without going into perennialism, but emphasizing difference so much that one goes into multiple religious worlds that have nothing to teach each other or nothing from which we can learn.
Okay. So you offer a middle way.
Indeed.
And that worked for the Buddha.
Indeed, yes.
He said he was offering a middle way, and 2,000 years later, he's very famous. So
this might be the better sales strategy.
Okay, well, listen, thanks so much. As I said, we've covered a lot of territory, but there's more to cover. So I hope down the road you'll have time to come back and talk some more.
It'd be a treat.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.